Hi, good evening. I'm Rosie McKinley. If you look for me in the Duke system, I'm actually Rose McKinley is my given name, but everybody just calls me Rosie. So I'm a third-year law student. I'm in the Startup Ventures Clinic along with Katie. This summer I worked at a firm called Cooley, which does a lot of emerging company work. And I specifically was in their emerging company practice, and that's where I'll be heading to after graduation. I'll be in their Palo Alto office, but they have offices all over the place. I've worked with the Duke Angel Network in my time at Duke, more in sort of like learning a little bit more about what you Fuqua folks do, which was interesting. And actually, I was curious, we kind of wanted to get a feel for who's in the room, so we might ask where you're from after I'll let Katie introduce herself first.
Hi, my name is Katie Hasnain. I'm a 2L at Duke Law, and I'm in the Startup Ventures Clinic. I still have my future undetermined ahead of me, so it'll be interesting where I end up working, but there are plenty of law firms around here and anywhere else you might happen to be that are always very interested in helping startups getting on their feet.
Yeah. And so I guess I'll ask some general questions. Are there any undergrads in the room? Right. And are you mostly upperclassmen? Okay.
Nice.
No? Underclassmen? Freshman. Wow. Okay, cool.
Impressive.
Oh, nice. Well, welcome. And then engineering students from the grad school? Okay. And then Fuqua, both of you? Cool. And then, what, divinity school?
Biology.
Who am I missing? Who haven't I called? Community. What's that? Nicholas? Oh, yeah. Nice. And medicine. Nice. Well, we'll get started with our slides here, but do feel free to interrupt at any time. It's kind of an evening event, and so of course we'll try and keep it casual. So just, yeah, feel free to speak up at any time. And then I just also had another starting question as to, has anyone worked in a startup before? Okay, great. And then have any of you worked with lawyers while you've been within the startup? So, all right, nice. Mostly like in transactional things, I hope, and not in litigation, but good, we try and stay away from that. I am gonna hope that I press this button in the right arrow. No?
Yes,
That's
that's who
right?
we
Yeah.
are, and that's the Startup Ventures Clinic website. So if you have any friends or anyone who need help, we're always out to help you.
Yeah, in the Startup Ventures Clinic, we have, I think, 9 clinics at the law school. The Startup Ventures Clinic specifically deals with, obviously, emerging companies, mostly early stage, folks who need legal help but don't quite yet have the financial wherewithal to pay for a lawyer, which gets to why the lawyer hate.
Hey, before we do that,
Yeah.
I just want to make a plug for us,
Oh, sure.
because I'm Brian, I'm Daryl Fruth, and Brian McGann, and we teach in the clinic. And so one of the things is that if you go on the INE website and you find us on the website, you can get a schedule for where we have free office hours, where we have 30 or 40-minute sessions. You can come, have confidential, create a attorney-client relationship, and get some legal advice for free. And there'll be 3 of these coming in the next few weeks, so you should look for that. The first one is going to be February 21st, so 2 weeks from today, from 1:30 till 3. And then the other thing is, since I'm a lawyer, I always have to put in the obligatory disclaimer that tonight we're not going to provide any legal advice. This is all for educational purposes, for our education anyways. So have fun.
Yeah. Thanks. It's always good to have that disclaimer in there. Perfect example.
This is just basic knowledge that we want you to have so that you feel less confused when you have an idea and you want to do something with it.
My mom was teasing me, says, you in the medical school you're probably used to now, like anytime someone in your family has like a headache, you get a call. I'm starting to experience this in law, where like anytime someone's like renting something, they're like, hey, does this sound right to you? And I just say like, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not holding myself out to be a lawyer. My mom's always been teasing me about that recently. But yeah, so that's one of the things, like if you enter into the Google search bar, you do see these things. I'm sure that's true about some lawyers, but they are seen as deal killers, right? So they slow down the process because they have to do things like check for conflicts and make sure that you're doing everything in a way that's not going to cost you later on down the line. And that's something that's definitely probably going to be like a repeat message from us over the night, which is that lawyers what they might cost in the short run, hopefully outweighs like long run costs of avoiding when you needed a lawyer but didn't have one. And so they are sometimes, though, get that reputation as deal killers. Don't understand the business aspect of things. That's one of the neat things about working with startup companies for us, is that we do get to see a lot of like the business side, where if you work with like larger institutional clients, you just don't get that feel. A lot of times lawyers are of course seen as like not understanding client needs, being slow and unresponsive, which of course goes along to the deal killer side, overly cautious with the risk. Evaluating risk presentation is probably something that a lot of lawyers could do well to go to. But we are seen as like, putting in roadblocks every here and there. And I guess the hope with lawyers is that those roadblocks are necessary and sufficient, and not overabundant in such a way that would kill a deal. And of course, being really, really expensive. And so it's important, and hopefully we'll convey this throughout the presentation tonight, that you are empowered to make decisions about when you need a lawyer and when the costs are prohibitive, and not a situation where you would get the value that you would be paying for. So why get a lawyer?
Okay, so we're going to go over the couple of things that are really helpful. One thing is that when you have an idea, is that leaving your current position, it can be really complicated. And so these are a couple of the issues that come up. And lawyers can help you choose the entity type, protecting your assets, and contracts with clients, service providers, and we'll go into depth. So leaving your, many times the ideas you have may be somewhat connected to where you were working, and so there can be a lot of trickiness in getting the okay from your employer, leaving on good terms, various things like that. Things like non-compete agreements that you might have signed. In California, they aren't enforceable, but for practically everywhere else, that might be a problem. Non-solicitation agreements, that's when you're talking about if you want to leave with your idea, that's fine, but they're worried that you might take some of your friends with you, your group, your team, and so you might have signed something like that. Whether you have the IP right over whatever you've come up with, or whether your employer does. And enforceability, and basically lawyers can help you with alternatives to litigation. As Rosie was saying earlier, like they're seen as deal killers, but at the same time, a little caution ahead of time can save you a big headache in the future.
Yeah, I might just add on to that with the alternatives to litigation. That's something that I think lawyers are increasingly aware of. It's just that a lot of clients just don't have the cost to afford litigation, because that is truly really, really expensive. And so if you're just trying to start a company and you're, is everyone familiar with the term non-compete agreement? You've seen this finale of Silicon Valley, I hope. Maybe I just gave that away. But basically, like, as an example for that then, like, no one is going to go to court over a non-compete agreement. Hopefully you would be able to work out with your employer, like, hey, what if we just create a new contract, or maybe I sign like a few $100s to you, and we work out a way where I give you some equity in the new company in exchange for you signing an agreement that you will not enforce the non-compete agreement. So alternatives to litigation, hiring a lawyer can often mean that they've probably worked on a similar case before, and maybe can help reach a point where you don't need to use litigation to get out of what might seem like an otherwise legally enforceable contract.
Mm-hmm. And non-compete agreements can also be like your company that you're working for is making sandwiches, but you're trying to make something else, not sandwiches, maybe pizzas or something. And so getting out of knowing where the non-compete ends, that you're not in competition with your former employer. And setting up a new entity and what to consider. So whether you want an LLC, or whether you're in a partnership, or something more like a corporation. Things to consider would be taxes, liability. Depending on what kind of entity you pick, they have advantages and disadvantages. Who gets sued, that's what liability would mean, and scalability. How big do you plan on getting your company to grow? Do you plan on having it just be your small pet project, or do you plan on becoming something more mega in the future? Investor preference, who gets paid when. Depending on what kind of entity you pick, that can vary. As well as knowing what is the controlling state and federal law regarding the entity you form. So lawyers can help start it out that way, or further down the road, you can convert whatever business you have into something a bit more strategic.
Yeah, and I guess it brings up the point that a lot of these decisions aren't ever set in stone, right? So if you, the filing fees to be an LLC are much less than filing to be a C corporation. And so if your hope is eventually to grow to a point where you do want to take on investors and that sort of thing, you want a C corporation so that way you can sell out different classes of stock to different kinds of investors. But the filing fees for that are significantly more than just forming initially as an LLC. And so one way to sort of like mitigate risk when you're starting a new company is to start as an LLC, and later on, once you get to the point of being able to take on investors, you can then kind of convert then into being a C Corp. And so there are different sorts of entity forms that you can take on. And I can touch on those, but how many people are like familiar with the difference between like partnerships, limited liability companies, C Corps and S Corps? I just don't want to be redundant.
Probably should go through each one.
Okay,
real quick.
sure, yeah. So basically the big idea between why you form an entity in the first place is to give yourself the corporate veil in a way. So to protect you from your assets ever becoming liable. And so the classic case is if you own a taxi company and if you never form an entity and then your taxi runs over someone, then your personal assets are at stake. So the person can sue you and like take all of your personal wealth. Whereas if you set up some sort of entity or corporate structure, when the person goes to sue you, they can't access your personal bank accounts. And there are exceptions to that, like if you were reckless or you were mingling the assets between the entity and your personal wealth from the get-go. But for the most part, if you set up an entity, it protects you from liability. So the limited liability is key. And so the different structures that allow you to do that, you can be a limited liability corporation, and that has certain tax benefits. And if I say the word tax too much, like I even myself will probably go to sleep. But it actually is really important and influences most of the decisions. So taxes. So with limited liability companies, you can get what's called pass-through taxation, and you're not subject to what's called the corporate double tax. So if a corporation pays out dividends to you, it's taxed as profit to the corporation and then also taxed in your personal income. With a limited liability company, you don't face that double tax. It's just taxed at one rate at your personal income. And so that's kind of like an overview of a limited liability company. You can still you can sort of issue equity out of it. It's a lot more complicated because you have to change a corporate, your LLC organizational agreement at that point. So it's not as easy to scale quickly. And so once you started taking on investors, you would want to transfer into a C Corp. A C Corp is like what most companies are. That was like the initial corporate form. And with a C Corp, you can issue out equity rather easily. Basically, every corporation has like, I think over 1 million. Like you want to set up as many shares as possible. And so that way, anytime you are issuing equity, you just pull it out of the pool again and again. Whereas with an LLC, you have to like amend your operating agreement every single time. So it's a lot more cumbersome. And you can also issue different classes of stock in a C Corp, which distinguishes it from an S corporation, which are fairly outdated, so I won't go into too much detail about them. But an S corporation basically limits the number of investors to 100, and you can't have different classes of stock. So if you're issuing in different rounds, it all has to be the same series, which is why most venture capitalists would never invest in an S Corp. And so mostly what you would see is for maybe some really early stage companies, you'll see LLCs. For companies that don't ever plan to kind of like grow to massive numbers or have any sort of large exit event, you'll see LLCs there as well. And then you'll see C corporations for like the later stage companies that plan to scale really, really quickly and have like huge exit events. So those are like the two main ones you'd see. Does that sound, did I miss anything there?
No, that was good.
So to go back to the premise of the evening, I have an idea, do I need a lawyer? Basically, if you run with your idea and don't necessarily form yourself into an entity, you might find yourself on the line for something that maybe is a 1 in a million chance. You come up with a carriage company and it runs over somebody, or you come up with some awesome food idea but somebody gets food poisoning and it blows out of control. This sort of thing, having a liability shield makes it so that you can keep having ideas, and so that just because you maybe an accident happened, you're not completely on the line for it.
And so I've worked with companies that have on their own set up their LLC agreements before. I think you can probably like go on the internet and find, maybe some of you have, has anyone ever used an LLC operating agreement on the web?
Like through like LegalZoom.
Yes, LegalZoom is
Yeah.
very popular.
Yeah, and so you can definitely do that, and then if there are, to the extent that there are any errors on that, you can always get it cleaned up later on by an attorney. But hopefully, this is kind of the tricky area where like hopefully those operating agreements that come through like standardized kind of entry forms are correct, and then if they're not, you can always fix it later on. It's just the risk is always like, what will you have to pay to fix it later on.
And so the next part would be risk management and protecting your assets. So the key part of this is that lawyers can frequently help you manage your relations between you and your other founders and idea holders and potential employees. Sometimes it's so exciting at first to have an idea, but then as you're collaborating together, somebody wants to take more control, people want to kick each other out. It gets very hostile if you don't have an intermediary. And what an attorney can do, even if it's just at our clinic, is that take a step back and think about what's good for the future of the company. Maybe you want to take most of the control, but other people are okay with that as long as they have creative control and being able to balance things together. Sometimes everything works out well, and so you don't really need someone to be the mediator, but lawyers can help with that. As well as protecting intellectual and physical assets. Sometimes if you have an idea and you don't protect it, it can get copied, internet, and you can lose control of your little gold mine pretty quickly. As well as getting. Oh, yes, you have a question?
Quick question, yeah, about protecting intellectual property. Say if you're looking for a patent attorney, and say there's a one-person firm versus a larger firm, is there a trade-off in terms of maybe later down the line, someone takes you to court over the patent? Is that potentially a reason not to choose the one-person firm because they're not able to sort of go to your defense? So basically, is that a consideration you should make when choosing a patent lawyer about whether they can have the resources to defend you after the filing?
Can I refer to you on that since you're the patent lawyer?
Yeah, so I'm a patent attorney and I mostly do IP assertion and litigation. And I would say two things to that. Number one, you should find a patent attorney that you're comfortable working with, and that's going to be the most important thing. And that might be a large firm, it might be a small firm. When you're doing prosecution, so that's when an attorney helps you ask the government for a patent and has kind of a negotiation. In that role, it's often helpful to have somebody that kind of knows the technology and knows the art and is able to speak really intelligently with the patent office. And so that, I think, might be a consideration. Like someone that you like, someone you trust, and maybe someone who knows the art. So you might want something more specialized. When it comes time to litigate, I don't think any of those really matter, because then you're going to be talking to a judge who isn't going to know anything about this at all. And you just need a good communicator who can understand what you're trying to do and present a good case. oftentimes your litigators are not even in the same law firm as your prosecutors, and it might happen, it might take 3 to 5 years for you to get your patent, and then who knows how long to litigate. So, so I wouldn't choose my prosecutor based on thinking about later litigation.
Potentially, the one-man firm could go and hire another firm to assist in the
Litigation process.
Well, not only could they do that, but that's what I've seen maybe 90% of the time that I've litigated. And there are benefits to that as well, because depending on how much your prosecution attorney needs to be involved in the litigation, it's often good to have a different set of lawyers so that your communications with those litigators can remain privileged, and you don't have to worry about sharing your internal communications between the lawyer and the client.
And just while we're on the note of litigation too, again, not legal advice, but something that I've seen, this is again not advice, I wouldn't ever necessarily, if I were in the position where I thought someone had taken my IP, just pull a letter from the internet and send it to the opposing side. Because a lot of times, like, when it comes to documents that need to be of any level of specificity beyond like formation docs, that's sort of the point where you need to start to bring in lawyers. I had worked for a startup company just as a first-year law student, and they had gotten this like letter from some sort of former coworker who had like claimed that they had stolen his idea, kind of thing. And it was like clear to a first-year law student that this was someone who had just like pulled a letter off of the internet and like inserted a few words. And so that would be like a trade-off. Is like, and we'll kind of come back to this, but once you start getting into higher levels of specificity, then, and this is probably obvious, but the need for a lawyer goes up and up and up. So like formation docs might be like a little bit more standardized, and you can kind of fix them later on. But once you start approaching like litigation type tasks, those you'll almost definitely need a lawyer for. Is it? Again, not advice, but just general observation.
Yes, and so we've talked about financial assets, human assets, as far as treating all the people you want to involve in your company fairly, as well as coming up with an exit strategy. Now that's the term for what you want to do with the company after it's gotten all right. Do you want to keep it running as like your little flower shop or food truck, or do you want it to be sold to a bigger company, have an IPO, initial public offering? What do you want to have happen to it? And so that's important to think about, at least even as you're forming your company, because it can influence what strategies you take.
And also on the note of kind of like organizational, who owns what. If you've worked at a startup, I'm sure you're probably familiar with like the idea of a cap table. So as a summer associate this summer, a lot of the time that I spent was like cleaning up cap tables that had just been like really messed up by the client. And those are like, even though it's an Excel spreadsheet, it's almost one of the most important documents you have. I would say it's like far more important than your charter that's like stored away somewhere in like the state of Delaware. So like your cap table is the spreadsheet where you keep a running list of who owns exactly how many shares to the exact like decimal point, when shares will vest, whether or not the like vesting has been exercised, and how many shares are left in the pool. So just as like a general note, it's something that like clients can definitely keep track of themselves if they're good with Excel. And that is non-legal advice that I'll definitely give, which is like practice Excel. It's such a useful tool. But yeah, your cap table is so important, and that's one area where you really don't, it's not legal in any sort of way, but I saw so many times this summer, like really high-end, highly valued companies with just like really severely disorganized cap tables, which definitely hurts later on. If you ever want to get acquired, you need to clear all that up. If you are merging with another company, different states require different numbers of voting approvals for your shareholders to make once you're trying to merge with another company. And so if your cap table is messed up, it's very difficult to find that out. And then you're paying a summer associate like $400 an hour to clean up your spreadsheet, which is obviously a really insufficient use of funds. And so that is like definitely an area where if you're the client, you don't need a lawyer to be able to keep track of your cap table, but a lot of people do mess that up. So that's one area you can definitely like not have a legal background in, to be able to keep a really, really good cap table.
And just to like, in case a cap table would be like who owns the company, and to make sure that you have a clear-cut idea of all the slices of pie that's going around, that if you're splitting the company between 6 family members, and then that person shares it with another person, and then basically what Rosie was saying with the Excel spreadsheet, to have it as it changes, very, very clearly cut down, because knowing who has how much of the company is going to be incredibly important for future reference. Okay, so contracts. Lawyers can help get it with investors, and making sure that the client and you with your startup go for the best deal, and not just the person who's offering the big bags of money right away, because that might come with big strings, like, oh, you get all the money, but at the same time you have to lose creative control, a variety of other things. As well with buyers and sellers, what are the terms? Just because you get a distribution line with someone, and at first that might sound really great because no one else wants to carry your new line of shoes or whatever you're selling, but that might lead to problems down the road. Maybe they want to be the sole seller of your shoes, and you can't get it to a wider market.
And on the note of contracts, just to be clear, like contracts can be like really, really informal, especially early on. Basically, like, again, going back to like kind of like classic contract law, but like notes on napkins have sufficed as actual contracts. And so contracts can sort of be like implied, and it's a very complex area of law. But a contract doesn't necessarily mean like the lease agreement you signed with your with your landlord, and it's like super formalized and all of that. Some contracts are really, really straightforward and simple, but I would always again, not legal advice, but just general observation, like it always is probably a good idea to formalize your contracts with someone and actually have like written documents saved somewhere on your computer, emailed back and forth between people, which is just another like kind of good best practice. It's just to kind of document everything as you're going, and put it in some sort of like formalized place, like even if you just email it to someone that you're working with that memorializes it in like a way that can't be later manipulated. It's just always a good idea to just keep things clear, and it's a great way of like avoiding litigation down the line, is to just have clear documentation of like what was clearly agreed upon, and also like not to suggest that people have like malintent or something like that, but just to avoid confusion later on, and also to make sure like in the present tense people are actually on the same page. I've definitely been in the room with folks who like are talking kind of past each other and think that they're on the same page, and then it's not until they both kind of like write down the actual terms that they realize like, oh, actually we're like a little bit off here. And so just basic things like formalizing what you've talked about, writing it down, and then making sure you like email it to someone can be like a very good practice and a way of avoiding having just like inefficiencies down the line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to go off of what Rosie was saying, it's like you want to avoid miscommunication, because at the end of the day, it's your company, and the more you communicate with each other and stay on the same page, the more you have a good chance for success. And so in summary, legal advice is important, and can be especially important in critical turning points. Just because we're suggesting legal advice at certain turning points doesn't mean if you don't have the capital for it, you need it throughout. You can always see an attorney for a short period of time. You are in charge of your company. You can determine when you need it and when you think the expense is too much, or when you don't have the time for it, for free clinics and things like that. And to be always aware of that you have resources, and to know that if you are confused or needing help with starting your company, there are people out there as well as the internet. And there are different, oh, Rosie was going to say this one.
Yeah, sure. So there's just to kind of like touch base on the different sorts of law firms and sort of like different levels of what you might need. And so there are like not everything is going to be this like giant New York law firm, and like for the most part you would never need them until you reach like an IPO. And for the most part they never represent even companies necessarily. So some of the biggest, what are called like in the legal world, white shoe law firms only ever represent like large institutional clients, like financial institutions that tend to be like what are called in the IPO an underwriter versus like the company side. So for the most part, like the largest law firms of the world, so like if you've ever heard the name like Cravath or Wachtell, like they're representing like banks and not the startup world. And then it's kind of like on the other side from that, there are a lot of like great law firms here within the Triangle area that do a lot of startup work. So with obviously the Triangle being like a booming area of entrepreneurship, there are some great firms here locally that have lawyers that are specialized to emerging company practices. A lot of them have like package deals for forming a company, maybe giving some like basic vendor agreements, financing documents. I heard from the last presentation that it's like around $2,000 to $3,000, but I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
It can be a little bit more depending on what your company is doing, but 2,000 to 3,000 is a good starting point.
And so that would be like once you're like maybe first taking on investments and really starting to like roll with it. Always ask about different kind of payment plans. I've heard different law firms offering different sorts of payment plans for like when exactly your payments are due. It's very rare, but in some sort of famous instances, law firms have actually taken equity in companies. There's sort of like odd ethical obligations around that for the lawyers, but to some extent that's possible. And then like once you're heading towards like a larger exit event or you're starting to take on really big time venture capital financing, that's when you might shift to like one of these like way more expensive, larger national or international law firms. But the idea being like, when you think of like lawyer, it doesn't have to be like someone wearing like, full on suit ready to go to the courtroom for you. It might be someone who's like very, very experienced with startup clients. And that would be another thing, like when you're looking for a lawyer, definitely ask who their clients are and see whether or not that sounds actually like the sort of company you are. And so you might be an early stage company, they might have a lot of work with emerging companies, but if you're somewhere like in the health space and all they've done is entertainment companies, they might be like kind of green when it comes to some of the issues that you might be heading towards. So always ask like who your current clients, tell me about some of the people you've worked with, and then kind of judge from there if it sounds like they have relevant enough experience to really be not just your lawyer, but also an advisor. That's something that we talk a lot about in the clinic and also like kind of throughout the law school is, especially when you're working with emerging companies, you have the opportunity to also sort of like give a little bit of business advice to the extent that you can, to the extent that your experience lends you that. And so it's great if you can find an attorney who's like worked in your space before. So here are some various like quality legal advice. Daryl mentioned our offices that will have office hours where you can kind of come and talk to us in confidence, and we might be able to point you in a more like specific direction. Obviously, to the extent that free advice is available online, you should use it with caution. For one thing, like lawyers are legally obligated to not just like be spewing out advice left and right. You really should be like keeping that to when you've established a relationship with a client. So always be wary of that. There is also the national, I should have put it on the slide here, I can send it out later too, but the National Association of Venture Capitalists has a lot of like documents standardized on their website that you can kind of find. I think it's useful just to kind of familiarize yourself with those sorts of documents, just to kind of see like what other people in this space are operating under. NC LEAP is put out by the North Carolina Bar Association. And then again, you can always like ask local firms about their fee structuring, whether or not you could like want to spend money on a lawyer who can kind of like help you from the get-go. You can always do a la carte services, or you can with some firms where you just like have like a one-off issue. It's not like a recurring relationship with the attorney. Oh, our Twitter. But that's basically like the end of our slides here. We're happy to like take questions. I think that it's not being recorded for the question part, so.
Yes.